So Mike, just send me when we're live on the thing. Is this okay? Ooh. Hey everybody, welcome to Red May here. I was just looking on my cell phone when we went live, so what a fool I feel like. We're going all the way to the end of May, and we've got, I don't know, about 10 more events, so I wanted to kind of hip you in on what you might be able to see, and also to tell you that one of the events we have scheduled later today has been rescheduled for Friday, June 5th. So we'll keep you posted on that. That's after geoengineering, will not be today. But tomorrow we roar right back at noon with Predation Confronts Decline, where the great Robert Brenner will give us his analysis of what's happening as the long downturn confronts COVID. Aaron Benenev will be part of that too. So it should be real interesting. At 5 p.m. tomorrow at Thinking the Pandemic, State and Revolution with Jason Smith, Michael Bray, Colleen Lai, Andrew Anastasi. On Wednesday at 1 p.m., the post-pandemic condition. 5 philosophers will give you a sense of what philosophers do during a pandemic. Anita Chari, Samir Gandesha, Olafemi Taiwo, Idris Robinson, and Rocio Zambrano. At 6 that evening is the Neoliberal City After the Plague with Sam Stein, Vincent Tao, Carrie Moon, ex-mayoral candidate of Seattle, Daisha Kim Hawkins, Brooke Stepp, Am Johal, and Charles Mudede. And on Thursday, May 28th at 2 p.m., something called The Weapon of Organization, 21st Century Struggles. And at 6 p.m., 5 p.m., The Age of Circulation Struggles with Joshua Clover, Nick Estes, Camila Vergara, and Glenn Coulthard, and a cast of thousands. Lots of stuff. So much that I can't even remember it. I'm going to get right on to today's panel, which I'm really excited about and also participating in. But I just want to say in the beginning, give us money. Give us what you can. Go to redmayseattle.org, click on donate, go to our YouTube TV page, click at the bottom. We need this to keep going. We have no institutional support. We want to do this again next year live. So give us what you can. And also we subscribe to our YouTube page, because you can, we get a few more subscribers and we'll be able to have live CC captions, so the differently able will be able to follow our stuff. But now I'll turn the event over to our narrator today, our moderator today, Gus Burns, who's a PhD student in English at the University of Washington. Click the,
I am muted now, sorry. Good. Thank you. All I'm going to do is briefly introduce the participants in today's panel, which is very exciting. From Seattle, we have Eva Chernyavsky. Eva Chernyavsky is professor of English at the University of Washington. She's the author of That Pale Mother Rising, Sentimental Discourses and the Imitation of Motherhood in 19th Century America, from Indiana University Press, 1995, and Incorporations, Race, Nation, and the Body Politics of Capital, from University of Minnesota Press, 2006. Her most recent book is Neo-Citizenship, Political Culture After Democracy, New York University Press 2017. Jodi Dean is an American political philosopher and professor in the political science department at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. She's the author of, among other books, Blog Theory, Aliens in America, The Communist Horizon, Crowds and Party, and most recently, The Comrade. Jason Reed is a professor of philosophy at the University of Southern Maine. He's the author of The Micropolitics of Capital and The Politics of Transindividuality. And lastly, Philip Wallstetter is a co-curator of Red May. First on the docket, Jodi Dean is going to give a presentation, and that'll be followed by responses from Eva, Philip, and Jason, and then we'll be taking questions from the audience, the remote audience that I'll be reading to the panelists. So I think that covers it. Jodi Dean.
Very provocative thought experiment. What if we aren't in capitalism anymore, but something worse? And when I first heard this, I was really skeptical. After all, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is an end to capitalism, as we've been told frequently over the last couple of decades. But then I started to realize that this isn't really the case anymore. And even before the coronavirus, right? It doesn't really hold that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, because we see popular culture all the time imagining the end of the world. I mean, imagining the end of capitalism. So the world is persisting, but it's not capitalist. So just a few examples would be movie franchises like The Hunger Games, various bits of science fiction, dystopic fiction, Game of Thrones, the wide array of survivalisms. I mean, the world continues after the zombie apocalypse, but it's not capitalist. So I decided then to think with Wark's provocation. And then I started to realize that it's the left that has time imagining the end of capitalism. So for example, over the last decade, conservative and libertarian commentators have been asking whether the future of the United States is mass serfdom. The idea is that the mass propertyless underclass survives by servicing the needs of high earners, for example, as personal assistants or trainers, childminders, cooks, cleaners, that sort of thing. Joel Kotkin has been forwarding the idea of a new feudalism. He actually has a brand new book just came out called New Feudalism or Neo Feudalism. And he does this in order to mount a defense of liberal capitalism, a defense of a vision of private property, entrepreneurialism, and suburban home ownership associated with the American way of life. Kotkin opposes what he presents as a green elitism of sustainability, less is more, hipster downsizing. And he links this green elitism to the dominance of Silicon Valley billionaires, elite universities, and the beneficiaries of public sector unions. For Kotkin, Neo-Feudalism is the threat that calls for a defense of carbon capitalism. My claim is that it's capitalism itself that is tending to neo-feudalism. The capitalist dynamics that led to imperialism as the monopoly stage of capitalism, right, Lenin's formulation, these today are tending toward neo-feudalism. Capitalism is producing its own gravediggers, but the gravediggers aren't proletarians. They are the tendencies transforming the capitalist system into something else. Now, tendencies are not all determining. There's a space for, a need for, a requirement for political action. We are in the setting we describe. We are in the picture that we take. So capitalism is turning itself into a neo-feudalism of new lords and new serfs, a micro-elite of platform billionaires and the massive service sector or sector of servants. Nevertheless, we can intervene and redirect it. And in fact, we must. Communism, the internationalist, universalist, and emancipatory egalitarian movement toward the abolition of private property and the division of labor is the only political economic arrangement that can provide a future for most of us. So let me just define some terms here. By capitalism, I mean a system where private property, waged labor, and commodity production propel the self-valorization of value. To maintain and legitimate itself, the capitalist system requires a particular state form, a bourgeois state of laws with claims to fairness and neutrality. Today's communicative capitalism is the system that is becoming neo-feudal as its own processes intensify and turn in on themselves. Monopoly concentration, intensified inequality, and the subjection of the state to the market have transformed accumulation such that it now occurs as much through rent, debt, and force as it does through commodity production. Globally, in the knowledge and technology industries, for example, rental income accruing from intellectual property rights exceeds income from the production of goods. In the US, financial services contribute more to GDP than manufactured goods. Capital isn't reinvested in production, it's eaten up and redistributed as rents. Valorization processes have spread far beyond the factory into complex, speculative, and unstable circuits, increasingly dependent on surveillance, coercion, and violence. In the complex networks of communicative capitalism, capitalism is turning itself into neo-feudalism. By communism, I do not mean the end of politics in a reconciled and harmonious totality. As we learn from psychoanalysis, antagonism is irreducible. It goes all the way down. Rather than heaven on earth, communism is the political form through which production for the sake of the capital accumulation of the few is replaced with production for the sake of meeting the needs of the many. It's a form for the collective self-emancipation of the proletarianized. And this is how Marx describes it in his discussion of the Paris Commune in the Civil War in France. So today's communicative capitalism is at a crossroads, communism or neo-feudalism. Communism names the emancipatory egalitarian mode of association to which we should aspire and for which we have to organize and fight. Neo-feudalism names the something worse to which capitalism is tending. It's what happens if we don't fight back. So I'm going to talk about 4 features of neo-feudalism, and they're interlocking, right? They're not like completely separate things. They mutually inflect each other. So the 4 are the parcelization of sovereignty, hierarchy and expropriation with new lords and peasants, desolate hinterlands and privileged municipalities, and then 4th, insecurity and catastrophism. So let me do the first one, parcelization of sovereignty. Perry Anderson and Ellen Meiksons Wood present the parcelization of sovereignty as a key feature of feudalism. 2 aspects of the parcelization of sovereignty are important for understanding neo-feudalism: fragmentation and extra-economic coercion. First, state functions are vertically and horizontally fragmented. Different sorts of political and economic authorities claim right and jurisdiction. Arbitration and compromise take the place of the rule of law. The line between legal and illegal becomes weaker. Second, political authority and economic power blend together. Now, feudal lords extracted a surplus from peasants through legal coercion, legal in part because the lords decided the law that applied to the peasants in their jurisdiction. Neo-feudal lords, like global financial institutions and digital technology platforms, use debt to redistribute wealth from the world's poorest to the richest. In both the feudal and the neo-feudal versions, economic actors exercise political power over a particular group of people on the basis of terms and conditions that the economic actors, the lords, set. For example, like what counts as permissible speech, right? Facebook decides that on its own with its algorithms and on its own terms. At the same time, political power is exercised with and as economic power. Not only taxes, but fines, liens, asset seizures, licenses, patents, jurisdictions, and borders. Under Neo-Feudalism, the legal fictions of a bourgeois state determined by the forms of neutral law and free and equal individuals breaks down, and the directly political character of society reasserts itself. The fragmentation and extra economic coercion characteristic of the parcelization of sovereignty exert a structuring effect on political and economic action today. 10% of global wealth is hoarded in offshore accounts to avoid taxation, that is, to escape the reach of state law. Law doesn't apply to billionaires powerful enough to evade it. The largest tech companies have valuations greater than the economies of most of the world's countries. Cities and states relate to Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, and Google as if these corporations were themselves sovereign states, negotiating with them, trying to attract them, and cooperating with them on their terms. Another example. Cash-strapped municipalities in the US use elaborate systems of fines to expropriate money from the people directly, impacting poor people the hardest. In her recent book, Punishment Without Crime, Alexandra Natapoff documents the dramatic scope of misdemeanor law in the already enormous US carceral system. Poor people, disproportionately people of color, are arrested on bogus charges and convinced to plead guilty to avoid the jail time that they could incur should they contest the charges. And we got to look at this when in the wake of the riots in Ferguson, Missouri that followed the murder of Michael Brown. As Natapoff writes, the city's municipal court and policing apparatus openly extracted millions of dollars from its low-income African-American population. Police were instructed to make arrests and issue citations in order to raise revenue, right? They were shaking the people down, right? Like minions of feudal lords, they used force to expropriate value directly from the people. Okay, next part, second set of attributes, hierarchy and expropriation, or new peasants and lords. Feudal relations are characterized by a fundamental inequality. Mike Sims-Wood emphasizes that the distinct feature of feudalism in the West is the exploitation of peasants by lords in the context of parcelized sovereignty. Anderson reminds us of exploitative monopolies, such as water mills that were controlled by the lord. Peasants were obliged to have their grain ground at their lord's mill, a service that they had to pay for. So not only did peasants occupy and till land that they did not own, but they dwelled under conditions where the feudal lord was, as Marx says, the manager and master of the process of production and of the entire process of social life. Now, already in 2010, in his influential book, You Are Not a Gadget, tech guru Jaron Lanier observed the emergence of peasants and lords of the internet. This theme has increased in prominence as the tech giants have become richer and more extractive, their owners becoming billionaires on the basis of the cheap labor of their workers, the outsourcing of work to third-party contractors, the free labor of their users, the tax breaks bestowed on them by cities desperate to attract jobs, and the solidification of their monopolies. Shoshana Zuboff's study of surveillance capitalism brings out a further dimension of tech feudalism, military service. Like lords to kings, Facebook and Google cooperate with powerful states, sharing information that these states are legally barred from gathering themselves. Overall, the extractive dimension of network technologies is now pervasive, intrusive, and unavoidable. The tech giants have become masters of the entire process of social life, which we've seen even more with the shutdown accompanying the virus. So while it's not quite right to say that the present is literally an era of peasants and lords, it is right to say that contemporary capitalist society is characterized by an intensification of inequality, more billionaires, greater distance between rich and poor, and the solidification of a differentiated legal architecture that protects corporations and the rich while it immiserates and incarcerates the working and lower class. So I want to talk a little bit more about two examples of this kind of emergence of lords and serfs, or this kind of new forms of hierarchy and expropriation. And the two examples I'll use are platformization and land privatization, because these index these tendencies around neo-feudalism. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to say a lot about them, but I'm going to just flag Nick Cernczek's Platform Capitalism and Brett Christopher's The New Enclosures. Oh, and by the way, Brett Christopher has a new book coming out from Verso this year called Rentier Capitalism. I've been reading the manuscript. It's fantastic. And it develops the ideas of around land in much more detail even than that he did in his book, The New Enclosures. So anyway, just a little bit about these two aspects of platformization and land privatization. The innovation of platforms is the way that their use generates data. So for example, Google sells access to its machine learning processes, like the pattern recognition algorithms and audio transcription services. Users of these processes pay Google for the service, and Google collects the data generated through the use of the service. So it's a kind of cloud platform that extracts rents and data, like land squared or land reflexivized. Lean platforms, that's one of Cernczek's terms, but these lean platforms like Uber and Airbnb, they also have a reflexive dimension. They extract rent without owning property at all, right? They extract rent by relying on an outsourced workforce that's responsible for its own maintenance, training, and means of work. Uber and Airbnb reconfigure items of consumption as means of accumulation. So one's car isn't for personal transport, it's for making money. One's apartment isn't a place to live, it's something to rent out. In both cases, what was personal property becomes an instrument for the capital and data accumulation of the lords of the platform, Uber and Airbnb. Turning to land privatization, over the past 40 years, over 2 million hectares of British public land, which is 10% of Britain's overall land mass, has been sold to private buyers. According to Christophers, this sell-off has occurred at various levels, from local to national, for various reasons and under various auspices in a piecemeal and fragmented process, right? Another gesture to this parcellated sovereignty. Christophers points out that Marx saw the enclosure of the commons as a necessary condition for capitalist development, insofar as this enclosure threw peasants off the land and forced them to sell their labor power in order to survive. Crucial to the new round of privatization has been a different set of tendencies. Quote, a rise in private sector land hoarding, Britain's growing transformation into a rentier type economy, one increasingly dominated by rents paid by the many to the affluent landowning few, and widespread social dislocation. So the new privatization is a move away from capitalism's profits and production and toward Neo-Feudalism's rents and hoarding. A third feature of Neo-Feudalism is the spatiality associated with, a third feature of Neo-Feudalism is a spatiality that was already associated with feudalism, but we see taking on another dimension now. And this is one of protected, often lively centers surrounded by agricultural and desolate hinterlands. And you've been seeing the recent images that have been up on the screen of these desolate hinterlands. We might also characterize this spatialization as a split between town and country, municipal and rural areas, urban communes and the surrounding countryside, or more abstractly, between an inside walled off from an outside, a division between what is secured and what is endangered, who is prosperous and who is desperate. Meiksons Wood says that medieval cities were essentially oligarchies, quote, with dominant classes enriched by commerce and financial services for kings, emperors, and popes. Collectively, they dominated the surrounding countryside, extracting wealth from it in one way or another. Outside the cities were the nomads and migrants who, facing unbearable conditions, sought new places to live and work, and yet too often came up against the walls. Phil Neal's recent book, Hinterland, and I thank Philip for suggesting that book to me last time I was in Seattle. Neal's book, Hinterland, notes patterns between China, Egypt, Ukraine, and the United States. All are places with desolate, abandoned wastelands and cities on the brink of overload. US hinterlands are sites of loss and dismantlement, places with fantasies of a flourishing capitalist past that for a while might have let some linger in the hopes that their lives and their children's lives might actually get better. remnants of an industrial capitalism that's left them behind for cheaper labor, the hinterlands are ripe for the new intensified exploitation of neo-feudalism. No longer making things, people in the hinterlands persist through warehouses, call centers, dollar stores, and fast food. Politically, the desperation of the hinterlands manifests in the movements of those outside the cities, movements that are sometimes around environmental issues like fracking and pipeline struggles, sometimes around land, privatization and expropriation, sometimes around the reduction of services like protest over hospital and school closings. In the US, the politics of guns positions the hinterlands against the urban. We might also note the way the division between hinterlands and municipality gets reinscribed within cities. This manifests in both the abandonment of poor areas and their eradication in capitalist gentrification land grabs. A city gets richer and more people become homeless, as we see in San Francisco, Seattle, and New York. Finally, the fourth feature of neo-feudalism, insecurity and apocalypticism. And but this is a kind of more of an affective and subjective feature that involves insecurity, anxiety, and apocalypse. But these kind of link the first or infuse the first three and bring them together. Now, there are good reasons to feel insecure. The catastrophe of capitalist expropriation of the social surplus in the setting of a grossly unequal, warming planet and a global pandemic, all of this is real. And it was real before the pandemic, but the pandemic has made it all the intenser. But at any rate, within this sort of neo-feudal imaginary, there's a kind of new ideology and unfolding that I think amplifies apocalyptic insecurity, and that we start to see in the embrace of the occult, techno-pagan, and anti-modern. So some examples of this would be Jordan Peterson's mystical Jungianism and the Russian Alexander Dugin's mythical geopolitics of Atlantis and Hyperborea. And we could also think of the Dark Enlightenment, Nick Land, and neo-reactionaries such as PayPal's billionaire founder Peter Thiel, who argues that freedom is incompatible with democracy. Along with other Silicon Valley capitalists, Thiel is concerned to protect his fortune from democratic impingement, and he advocates strategies of exodus and isolation, such as living on the sea and space colonization, whatever it takes to save wealth from taxation. Extreme capitalism goes over into the radical decentralization of neo-feudalism. So I've set out these four elements of past European feudalism that I think are operative as tendencies for neo-feudalism. And again, they are parcelization of sovereignty, hierarchy and expropriation, cities and hinterlands, and insecurity and apocalypticism. Together, what they let us see is the present not actually as capitalist, but as a neo-feudalism born of capitalist processes as they intensify and turn back in on themselves. So just to make sure this is completely clear, I am not making a historical claim about feudalism's fundamental structure, and I'm not making an empirical claim about all existing feudalisms. What I'm trying to do is draw out tendencies that help us make sense of the present. Okay, so now what I need to do is to try to make good on this claim that they can help us make sense, oh, wait a minute, of the present. Let's go back. Okay, there we go. Did I lose? No, there we go. Okay. So what then is the political purchase, right? How can we make sense of this, particularly if we're not going to repeat the right-wing version of this, but recognize this as helpful for the left? First, I think the neo-feudal hypothesis lets us locate the primary conflict today within capitalist processes. The big confrontation is not between democracy and fascism. That makes no sense, particularly given the increasing power of oligarchs, financiers, media and real estate moguls, carbon and tech billionaires. Thinking in terms of neo-feudalism forces us to confront the impact of monopoly, hoarding, and extreme economic inequality on political society and institutions. It makes us reckon with the fact of billionaires offshoring trillions of dollars of assets and walling themselves into their own enclaves while millions become climate refugees and hundreds of millions struggle to survive. Second, the neo-feudal wager signals a change in labor relations. Not even the barest fantasy of freely given consent accounts for the social relations of wealth accumulation today. In the service-dominated economies of the global north, majorities work in service sectors. Some find that their phones, bikes, cars, and homes have lost their character as personal property and have been transformed into means of production or means for the extraction of rent. Most of us constitute a propertyless underclass, only able to survive by servicing the needs of high earners. For example, as personal assistants, trainers, tutors, childminders, cooks, cleaners, all that, right? And I've been wondering lately, like, for what or for whom are the essential workers essential? A report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics says that over the next 10 years, the occupation that will add the most jobs is personal care aides, right? Not health workers, but aides who bathe and clean people, right? Literally servants. The waged are further expropriated of their minimal incomes via unavoidable debts, fees, fines, and rents. And don't forget that in the US, taxes on people are redistributed to corporations. In 2018, 57 corporations, including Amazon, not only didn't pay taxes, but received money back, right? Received tax rebates. Third, thinking in terms of neo-feudal, oh crap, sorry, my text got messed up here. Third, thinking in terms of neo-feudalization or neo-feudalizing tendencies enables us to identify a primary weakness of the contemporary left, particularly on the left of ideas that have a lot of currency. And I want to say that they have currency in part because they affirm rather than contest neo-feudalism. For example, localism encourages parcelization. Tech and platform approaches reinforce hierarchy and inequality. Municipalism affirms the urban-rural divide associated with hinterlandization. Emphases on subsistence and survival proceed as if peasant economies were plausible, not only for that half of the planet that lives in cities, which is 82% of North Americans and 74% of Europeans, but also for the millions displaced already by climate change, war, and commercial land theft. Even worse, such emphases on like subsistence and survival occlude the ever worsening conditions for agriculture, as if droughts, floods, and fires were not leading to crop loss around the world. Those dwelling in the hinterlands face political, cultural, economic, and climatic conditions that make it so that they can't survive through agricultural work. Approximately 50 countries are classified as low-income food deficit countries. Most bear the initial brunt of the changing climate, and most are in Africa. Universal basic income is a similarly untenable survivalist approach. It promises just enough to keep those in the hinterlands going, so long as they don't go to the cities where they can't afford to live. The fourth element, insecurity and apocalypse, that takes shape in that left catastrophism preoccupied with extinction and the end of the world, as if the next 100 years or so just don't matter. And we also see it in the renewed mysticisms around witchcraft and magic. Popular left ideas mirror neo-feudal tendencies as they converge via the abandonment of hinterlands, rural areas, and small cities that have been left behind, and the cultivation of those elements of the urban that benefit the rich and educated, and like our wonderful robot future. Far from a vision anchored in the emancipation of the working class, this model can't even see a working class. When work is imagined, and some on the left think we should adopt a post-work imaginary, it looks like either romantic risk-free farming or tech work, right? Immaterial labor. By now, the exposés on the drudgery of call center work, not to mention the trauma-inducing labor of monitoring sites like Facebook for disturbing illicit content, these have made the inadequacy of the idea of immaterial labor undeniable. It should be similarly apparent that the post-work imaginary also erases industry, manufacturing, the production and maintenance of infrastructure, and the wide array of labor necessary for social reproduction, as well as the underlying state structure. Given that most cities are on coasts, this model lacks the institutional basis necessary for responding to the changing climate. So the neo-feudal hypothesis lets us see both the appeal and the weakness of popular left ideas. They appeal because they resonate with the dominant sense. They are weak because this dominant sense is an expression of tendencies to neo-feudalism. So before I close, I want to say a little bit about communism. The four characteristics of neo-feudalism can also help. They're not just critical, right? It's not just a way to criticize the left or current ideas. I actually think they also let us locate possibilities that with political organization and will can be pushed in a communist direction. So parcelization can be reframed as the weakening of the nation state necessary for communist universalism, rendered not as fragmentation, but as the separation of elements that might be reconfigured into the new global state structures necessary for confronting the catastrophe. Transnational organizations suggest the plausibility of communizing structures across and beyond nation states. It's not hard to imagine them repurposed as the institutions of global communism, devoted not to capital accumulation and protecting the hoards and privileges of the billionaires, but to the emancipatory egalitarianism, but repurposed toward the emancipatory egalitarian flourishing of the many. And of course, getting there requires political struggle. The capitalist class doesn't just roll over. But parcelization reminds us that their power is more fragile than any of us often acknowledge. This fragility, as well as the necessity of central planning, have been key takeaways from the reaction to the coronavirus. With the second part, the lords and serfs and this new kinds of hierarchy, inequality and expropriation, these also provide an opening. The communist path recognizes this division as the class conflict that it is and takes the side of the peasants, the service, the service sector, the servants, the proletarianized. Eliminating the lords, we abolish private property and seize the means of communication, production, transportation, etc., making production serve human need. It's not hard to dissolve trillions of dollars of fictitious capital. The capitalist system does this regularly. We would just do it intentionally. Liberated from the constraints of capital accumulation, we could finally grapple with fundamental choices regarding our collective life rather than having these choices determined for us and behind our backs. With a vision of communism mindful of the hinterlands, we open up new possibilities for organized struggle attuned to agriculture, distribution centers, shipping, and the infrastructures of provisioning. The intensifying politics around migration, deportation, and refugees, the class struggles unfolding in various forms on the outskirts of cities, and the growing anger of the hinterlands dispossessed that we see vividly in France and in the electoral politics driving the right in the US, Hungary, Poland, Canada, and elsewhere. This gives us a setting of real struggle that is as yet undecided. There's nothing inevitable about the shift to the right. It's a matter of organizing, of offering a politics that speaks to a wide array of human needs and concerns, and that offers the possibility of flourishing. Finally, instead of plagued by insecurity and apocalypticism, we can and must cultivate communist virtues of solidarity, courage, discipline, and confidence, virtues that emerge out of and engender a sense of comradeship. Anything less dooms us to neo-feudalism. So to conclude, I've argued that capitalism is tending to neo-feudalism. This does not mean that there are no longer capitalist relations of production and exploitation. It means that the other dimensions of capitalist production, expropriation, domination, and force, have become stronger to such an extent that it no longer makes sense to posit free and equal actors meeting in the labor market even as a governing fiction. It means that rent and debt feature as or more heavily in accumulation than profit, and that work increasingly exceeds the wage relation. It means that the state form associated with the bourgeoisie has been radically altered. Just as Lenin's account of imperialism as a stage of capitalism made clear that there were still capitalist relations, but in a new form, one where monopoly, finance, and the territorial division of the world necessitated another analysis, so might neo-feudalism lead us to a different appreciation of the forces communicative capitalism has itself produced. What happens when capitalism is global? It turns in on itself, generating, enclosing, and mining features of human life through digital networks and mass personalized media. This reflexivization produces new lords and serfs, vast fortunes and extreme inequality, and the parcelized sovereignties that secure this inequality while the many wander and languish in the hinterlands. Avoiding this, confronting this, requires the organized political struggle for communism. So that's it. Thanks very much. Let's see, I'm trying to stop the screen share.
That was an early graphic before we expanded the panel. There we go. The slideshow is off almost.
Good, thanks. I'm having trouble figuring out how to stop that.
Sean or Mike, you have an idea? Click to exit.
Yeah, right up near the top of the screen, I think there's a...
There you go. They got that off. And then...
I'm sorry, do I go to the Zoom feature to turn it off, or?
Try clicking share screen on the Zoom and see if that'll turn it off. I don't know that it will, but where is that?
There we go, I see it.
Okay, there we go. Good. Okay, I will go here. So where to begin this story of the neo-feudal turn? With the indisputably medieval topic of usury, of which Thomas Aquinas said, to take usury for money lent is unjust in itself because this is to sell what does not exist, and this evidently leads to inequality, which is contrary to justice. Many US states had usury laws. North Dakota, upper limit of interest 5.5%, Minnesota 8%, Texas 10%. National banks and the credit card industry pushed for the deregulation of interest rates and won it in a 78 Supreme Court decision called Marquette National Bank versus First of Omaha Service Corporation, which held that state usury laws did not apply to nationally chartered banks. And this was followed by a 1980 Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act, granting state banks the privileges to charge whatever national banks charged. One could start there, or maybe with the wonderful medieval topic of mercenaries. Is Eric Prince and Blackwater the contemporary equivalent of Sir John Hawkwood and the White Company, who fought all over Italy for money? These are all possible entry points, but I want to focus on the core thing of what Jodi talked about, which is the parcelization of sovereignty. I won't read all of it. Perry Anderson quote explaining it. It's basically overlapping jurisdictions. He says, manors did not generally coincide with single hamlets, but were distributed across a number of them. Thus, in any given village, a multiplicity of manorial holdings of different lords would be interwoven. They had ecclesiastical justice on top of that and territory. So it was very complicated in terms of who had jurisdiction over what. And I wanted to go to contemporary examples to just trace this out. Now, parcelization of sovereignty happens every time you sign a form with pages of boilerplate, or when you click I agree for some service on the internet after being shown a long stream of fine point print terms you don't scroll through. It's not just that you've deleted some of your legal rights, the day in court guaranteed to every American citizen, for example, and are subject to arbitration. You've left the realm of American law and entered an alternate legal universe created by Apple or Amazon or Microsoft. Where the US Constitution no longer operates as a trump card. You've hopped from one zone of sovereignty to another and you didn't even need a passport. Click, you're in another country. 2, you got trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Obama was pushing to include provisions for what's called ISDS, or Investor State Dispute Settlement. It allows a foreign company to claim that a law passed in a US state where it operates, an environmental regulation, let's say, would expropriate future profits. It ensures that this claim be adjudicated, not by the state courts, but by a special arbitration tribunal. In other words, by signing such a treaty, the US surrenders part of its sovereignty to a vague entity located somewhere offshore. 3, Dara Orenstein's new book, Out of Stock, The Warehouse in the History of Capitalism, tracks the evolution of the warehouse from enclosed space to store goods to a site of legal arbitrage, a fictive zone where goods can be simultaneously on US soil and off US customs territory. 4, cities can now arbitrage legal systems. Instead of merely locating tax-free special enterprise zones along global supply chains as a way of expediting and cheapening logistics, major cities and even national capitals, according to Keller Easterling in Extra Statecraft, are now engineering their own zone doppelgangers, their own non-national territories in which to create newer, cleaner alter egos, free of any incumbent bureaucracy. So on one side of the bay, Seoul, South Korea. On the other, I think this is the right name, Songdo, it's double. It's like that China Mayville novel, The City and the City. Cities and nations can operate as needed between multiple jurisdictions with potentially conflicting laws by intentionally dividing their sovereign space into heavily and lightly regulated realms. 5, at the moment when Henry Paulson and the Treasury were struggling with Congress to mobilize support for TARP, to bail out the American financial system, the Federal Reserve, without public consultation of any kind, the Federal Reserve poured trillions of US taxpayer dollars into banks in Europe and Asia to add liquidity when the private markets froze up. The US acted as lender of last resort for world capitalism. So feudalism offered overlapping jurisdictions and parcelized sovereignty. What succeeded it was the system of national and dynastic territories established at the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Every territory has a boundary, an inside and an outside. Each is sovereign within its territory. By the time the last dynasties fell in World War I, all those territories had become nation states. Now, this arrangement spun into yet to be resolved turmoil when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard in the 70s, unleashing capital and destroying the Bretton Woods Agreement. Capital was now at large, wild, turbocharged, and a stable successor system is not yet in place. Neo Feudalism is one tendency visible in a wider emergent field. Neo Feudalism combines a parcelization of the nation state with a loose supernatural structure that plays the role of Christendom or the Holy Roman Empire. This would be the mostly intact but contested structure of global capitalist sovereignty, the form of laws and logistical chains gridded over the earth. Capital still reproduces itself along these lines, even as more and more of the parcelized are living outside of its circuit. Capitalists use the legal shell and military power of the nation state to reconfigure the world for capital flow, while at the same time withdrawing offshore. So I wanted to focus on 2 neo-feudal tendencies. 1, the judicialization of politics, and 2, the delinking of state and nation. What are neo-feudal politics? Essentially, the court replaces the assembly. In feudal times, there was no legislative power, no bureaucracy. At best, there might be a king's council offering informed advice. Perry Anderson again. Political power came for a period to be virtually identified with the single judiciary function of interpreting and applying the existing laws. Moreover, in the absence of any public bureaucracy, local coercion and administration, policing, fining, tolling, and enforcing powers inevitably accrued to it. It's thus necessary always to remember that medieval justice factually included a much wider range of activities than modern justice because it structurally occupied a far more pivotal place within the total political system. It was the ordinary name of power. The site where what passed for politics was enacted was the manorial court, one of the many overlapping jurisdictions where the majority of peasant subjects were supervised. And in Neo-Feudalism, the movement from politics to judicial supervision is part of what Mbembe calls the becoming black of the world. Jodi talked about it in Ferguson and so forth, so I won't go into that. Political theories of deliberative democracy assume the existence of a public assembly where the word is spoken aloud in highly charged debates in which the outcome of the republic is at stake. The Greek agora, the Roman Senate, Hannah Arendt's American Revolution. Quo usque tandem abutere Catalina patientia nostra. How much longer, Cataline, declaims Cicero, will you continue to abuse our patience? The famous speech that saves the day by exposing a conspiracy to overthrow the republic. It's the declamatory tone of the Republican peril that the Democratic representatives took against Trump during the impeachment, except this time around it played as pure farce. Why was it so ludicrous? Eva Chernyevsky's notion of neo-citizenship helps us here. The state's overarching goal now is to facilitate the accumulation of capital, to subsidize the market, a much more complex and time-consuming activity than ever before. Other than repression and surveillance, it offers very little to us. Neoliberal pedagogy cures us of the notion that the institutions of government maintain any obligation to our welfare. The state withdraws from us. Good luck, you're on your own. It dissolves the field of relationships of subjects to government that has gone by the name of citizenship. It offers fewer and fewer meaningful choices. And yet, it chastises the American people for its political apathy. It blames the electorate for its abandonment by the state. In short, we're subjects, not citizens, or at best, neo-citizens, which is a kind of decaffeinated citizenship. It's the age of Trump, and the Democrats think they're still in the Roman Senate. I would argue that nation and state are becoming delinked. Nations are sustained by citizens and are largely created, as Balibar points out, through narrative. But narrative capacity withers under neo-citizenship. In our neo-feudal moment, one could say that narrative becomes more medieval, in the sense of being more decentered and less coherently a whole, incapably of being grasped by a mind schooled in perspective and consistency. Eva Chernyevsky writes, insofar as the state is reimagined, no longer the proxy of a sovereign national people, but a managerial power dedicated to the concentration of capital among ever smaller fraction of elites, there is scant political value to the ideological production of an inclusive reality and of the relatively fixed, relatively durable reference points that sustain it. If power is no longer bound up in the reproduction of mass social entities, why pursue the quite extraordinary labor of fabricating the world in which such an entity can exist? Political power no longer presents as the capacity to norm public sentiment, to bind the popular masses both broadly and deeply to a certain vision of the world and to specific forms and spheres of self-expression that will supposedly secure their place within it. Instead, we are moving into a context where the interests of the ruling elements are most aptly served by decomposing the social body and permitting us to dwell in whatever unrealities of our own devising. Or again, power increasingly takes the form of declaring autonomy from having to live in anyone else's world. So public narratives now take the quasi-medieval form of 1, I never borrowed a kettle from you, 2, I returned it to you unbroken, 3, the kettle was already broken when I got it from you. Trump is the master of assertive incoherence. Because the state is totally absorbed with its task of keeping capital accumulation going, it depends on a hyperbolically asserted nation to do the job that nation and state used to do together. But this fractured narrativity is incapable of sustaining a national identity. Examples of, this hyperbolic assertiveness is Wendy Brown's book on walls, where she talks about how the walls, or Trump's wall polity, is entirely rhetorical and performative. It's not that that sort of stuff is efficient, and it's that capital needs workers to come in and do low-wage labor to pick stuff in the fields. It's just that the wall is put there as a symbol that we're still living in the Peace of Westphalia enclosed sovereignties and states. The other, despite invocations of the so-called rule of law, ad hoc actions become more common than constitutionally grounded ones. Hart and Negri write, local arrangements occur in a variety of forms as different sorts of political and economic authorities claim right and jurisdiction. Arbitration and compromise take the place of the rule of law. The line between legal and illegal becomes weaker. And the third thing is that military action takes a form that is neither war or peace, but low-level, endless policing. I'll stop. Raids on different castles is what I put there. I'll stop there. I have things about what connects the world together with capital, but I'll let someone else talk and bring it up in conversation.
Okay, am I up next? All right, well, I just want to start actually by thanking Jodi for an amazing talk. I think that's just an incredibly productive redescription. I also couldn't agree more that the democracy fascism binary gets us absolutely nowhere. So I think it's really rich rethinking this in terms of the neo-feudal tendencies of capitalism itself. I also really love the focus on tendencies. I think that gets us out of all kinds of tiresome arguments about sort of taxonomies, right? What isn't or isn't properly capitalist. So I found that incredibly useful. And I think I was also drawn, like Philip, to the question of the parcelization of sovereignty among the sort of ensemble of features of neo-feudalization that Jodi cites. I think that's the one that gets the least attention. So I also really appreciated Philip's elaboration of that. I want to respond then by pressing the argument further. And Philip has stolen a little bit of my thunder here, but I want to ask about the bearing of capitalism's neo-feudal tendencies on the domain of politics. So one feature of contemporary neo-feudalism, as Jodi observes, and I think this actually might be in a longer version of the talk that I read. I'm not sure this made it into the version you just gave, but I think it's nevertheless clear from your remarks that you point out that the fiction of formal equality and of choice, workers' choice, citizens' choice has obviously evaporated. And we are confronted with the directly political character of society. So the question I want to ponder is, what does this direct politicization entail for the arena of politics, for struggles around who governs and how and to what ends? And that prompts me to sort of like Philip, return to the feudal context for a minute and ask about what politics looks like in the feudal world. And I think you were getting at some of this, Philip, a few minutes ago when you were talking about the centrality of the court. It seems to me that politics in a feudal world is essentially the terrain of the elite, right? So political struggles, that is, struggles about who governs and how and to what ends, are played out between a monarch, an aristocracy, a clergy. In the later Middle Ages, we can think about ascendant commercial interests, but the wider population, the peasants, right, the serfs, the 99% or 97% or whatever it would have been, are not a party to those struggles. There are obviously peasant insurgencies, right? The Lord fails to open the granary in a time of famine. There's a riot, right? So there is popular insurrection, And there is certainly a politicized popular culture. So there are avenues of political expression, but it seems to me that in the context of feudalism, there is little or nothing by way of a popular politics. And I think this is what you were getting at too a few minutes ago, Philip, right? That popular politics emerges, or maybe more accurately, reemerges with capitalist modernity, right? It's a function of that historically vexed marriage between capitalism and democracy. We could put this in Gramsci's terms and think about the peculiar character of the bourgeoisie, which he says is its desire to encompass the whole of society. Gramsci refers to this as the revolutionary organicism of the bourgeoisie. That is the desire to proceed politically as though its interests coincided with the interests of society as a whole. So this aspiration brings us a number of potent fictions. It brings us the fiction of the popular sovereign. It brings us the fiction of rule of law. But I think it also gives us an actual terrain of political struggle, which is the terrain of modern mass politics. So where are we then today? We're seeing the divorce of capitalism from democracy. Again, I find redescribing this as a neo-feudal turn really clarifying. States are less and less sovereign. They function rather as sort of vassals or tributaries to a variety of corporate and financial entities. The pretense of any obligation to a broadly conceived social good is dropped. States are overtly dedicated to the upward redistribution of wealth. The infrastructure of the old bourgeois state is increasingly hollowed out, right? So elections look increasingly like reality TV, right? These sort of fierce competitions with barely any stakes. Political parties conduct themselves like sort of warring mafias, certainly in the US. If we look at civil society, labor unions are on their knees, and we have a social justice-oriented nonprofit sector that seems primarily in the business of fundraising. That's obviously a very kind of jaundiced view. There are ways in which we could nuance that. I do think there are some possibilities around electoral politics at a really local level. We did manage to keep Amazon from simply owning the Seattle City Council. That was a modest win. But again, that's operating at the level of localism, right? That Jodi was talking about a minute ago. So it's a very limited horizon of political mobilization. So the question on my mind is this: where does neo-feudalism leave popular politics? What are the organizational vehicles for mass political mobilization against the overlords? And the reason I ask that question is that it seems to me that what it means to be a peasant is to have one's political capacity stripped. That doesn't mean that it can't be rebuilt, but it does suggest to me that much of what we're talking about when we talk about the need for organization and for struggle, much of what we're citing there is a political, sort of political repertoire that I think is not available to the peasants. So I think it requires a kind of reimagination or a reconstitution of the train of struggle. So I think Jodi makes a really powerful argument about what the framework of neo-feudalism allows us to see, right? She says it offers, it forwards the need for us politics, for a different kind of politics that speaks to a wide array of human concerns. And I couldn't agree more with that. But I doubt that the root, or it seems to me right now that the root of our problem is not misrecognition, right? There is a broad understanding that the game is rigged in favor of the 1%. There is a broad sensibility to the fact that our choices are no choices at all. Right? I mean, certainly in the current moment, right, where people are choosing between exposing themselves to potentially lethal disease or having no income and no way to pay rent and buy food, that could not make more viscerally clear that our choices are none at all. Mike Davis referred to this the other day on Democracy Now! As a kind of Sophie's choice, right? So what worries me is not how we build an alternative political imaginary. I mean, there's work to do around that. I absolutely agree, but I think the moment is ripe for that. What worries me is how we build or how we rebuild political capacity when I think capitalist neo-feudalism has decommissioned so many of the institutions of modern mass political struggle. I was thinking about this recently in the context of the fate of the Sanders campaign, where we were confronted, as everybody talked about, right, with the situation in which majority sentiment was in favor of universal health care, free college, but they were not, there was no support for the candidate who actually endorsed those, or not sufficient support for the candidate who actually endorsed those things. And that led to, Bernie talked about this in terms of winning the ideological battle, but using the electoral battle. And there was lots of punditry around calculations. Allegedly, the electorate was sort of making fine calculations around electability, none of which seems to me even remotely persuasive. I actually thought that situation cuts much deeper. And seems to me that it speaks to, it's an indication of the way that mass political desire no longer links up with anything, right? People have learned that electoral politics is not a terrain of meaningful struggle for things they might actually want. And arguably they're not wrong in that, right? But there's also no alternative, right? It's not like their unions are going to deliver that for them either. So that's what I find really arresting about the outcome of this election, right? This sense that political desire is now just sort of fully uncoupled from the existing terrain of political mobilization. So I would like to, I guess I would just add to the questions that neo-feudalism raises this one. How do we confront this withering of the arena of mass political struggle? And I will end there and turn things over to Jason.
Thanks. Thanks to Jodi for writing such a provocative piece, and thanks to Red May and Philip for inviting me to respond. So I have a quick response that I'm calling Neo-Feudalism with Capitalist Characteristics, a response to Jodi Dean. In the concluding section of her essay, Jodi Dean sums up the difference that neo-feudalism makes as a tendency. She writes, quote, "The difference is that non-capitalist dimensions of production, expropriation, domination, and force have become stronger to such an extent that it no longer makes sense to posit free and equal actors meeting in the labor market, even as a governing fiction." So what's striking to me is that Jodi picked this aspect and not some discussion about the prevalence of rent or debt and so on to define the neo-feudalist moment or the neo-feudalist tendency. And this returns me to thinking about the way Marx understood the difference between feudalism and capitalism. And in Capital specifically, the one thing that Marx returns to again and again is that in feudalism, the difference between necessary and surplus labor is clearly demarcated. Right? You go to a different plot of land, you work for your lord, and you're aware of the exploitation. While in capitalism, the difference between surplus and necessary labor, the very fact of exploitation itself, is necessarily obscured. People go to work and receive a wage which seems to encapsulate the entirety of the value of the labor power they sell. And Marx, at times, attaches a great deal of importance to this kind of obscuring moment of capital, and especially the way in which this notion of free and equal actors is generated as kind of a spontaneous ideology of capitalism itself, stemming from the wage relation, stemming from the market in which everyone meets each other as, freedom, equality, and Bentham, and so on. As Marx writes in Capital, all the notions of justice held by both the worker and the capitalist, all the mystifications of the capitalist mode of production all capitalism's illusions about freedom, all the apologetic tricks of vulgar economics have as their basis the form of appearance discussed above, the form of appearance of the wage relation, which makes the actual relation invisible and indeed presents to the eye the precise opposite of that relation. In other words, free and equal actors is the governing fiction that separates feudalism from capitalism. My question, the question I want to ask here, is what really happens to this fiction under some of the transformations that Dean calls Neo-Feudalism? In other words, I wonder if the four features of Neo-Feudalism that Jodi mentions, the parcelization of sovereignty, hierarchy and expropriation with new lords and peasants, desolate hinterlands, and insecurity and catastrophism, just much challenge this fiction, but take place in and through it. To take one example, the new forms of hierarchy and expropriation associated with platforms and cloud computing benefit from an ability to obscure and efface not just how much is being exploited, as with labor, but that there is any exploitation, any economic relation at all. People posting all sorts of personal data to various websites and servers are often unaware that they're giving anything, let alone what its value is to the companies that are utilizing it. As Philip mentioned, no one ever reads the user agreements. And on top of that, the fact that so many of these services present themselves and their customer-facing side is freely available obscures that there is any kind of subordination or any kind of exploitation at all. So in some sense, the cloud platform is not only land squared, as Dean says, in terms of power, but the wage squared in terms of mystification. Workers selling their labor power for a wage at least knew what they were surrendering, even if they were unclear on its value and its role in capitalism. Most of the new peasants of digital economy are unclear on precisely what it is they are surrendering and how. Of course, one could argue that the other elements of neo-feudalism that Dean points out are more clear in their brutality and directness. The parcelization of sovereignty would seem to offer the clearest example of an extension of power that can no longer be maintained within the fiction of free and equal individuals confronting each other in the market. But even this clarity is often obscured by another aspect of the spontaneous ideology of capital, and that is the extension of the right of property. The increased powers of various corporations take on the role of states is often accompanied by an utter inversion of the relationship between workers and capital, an inversion that's often indicated by the use of the phrase job creator. The owners of private property, even when that private property is as immaterial as data, claimed increased powers over individuals, over society, and so on, under the increased power of property itself, because property creates jobs, creates the wonders of the internet, and so on. It is allowed to do whatever it wants. It might be possible to say that for a while, much of the age of capital, the social power of private property, the ability of property to command labor and dictate lives, was concealed behind the idea of individual private property. Every capitalist compares losing their factory to thieves breaking into your home and taking your stuff. Now the social power of private property throws off such justifications and directly claims its rights as a social power. In the current moment, as states reopen in the midst of a pandemic, that power, the social power of capital, includes the power to take life or let live, intermingled with what Joshua Clover refers to as the power to make work and let buy. This power seems less like the parcelization of sovereignty to me than the division between the state and capital as two sides of a sovereign power. It is only because the state has retreated from any but the most minimal provisions of social welfare, $1,200 checks that everyone got, that employers will be able to expose people to death. The state has perhaps always been the condition of capital's power, only now there's the added corollary that capital is the condition of the state, as the surveillance gathered across the digital spectrum becomes the condition for an increase in state power. In both cases, property openly announces itself as a social power. Neo-feudalism, this transformation of the power of property and new modes of extraction of wealth, is built, it seems to me, not just on the material conditions created by capitalism, but its ideological conditions as well. Or more to the point, the fetishization, the tendency to not only reify social relations, but to conceal exploitation beneath the facade of equal actors is a fundamental condition, it seems to me, of a kind of neo-feudalism. As Marx argued, capitalism is not just a new mode of production, but a new and even much improved mode of subjection, one that conceals subjection by masquerading it as agency. Its alibi is the equality of the labor contract and the wage as a measure of labor power. It seems that neo-feudalism cannot be understood as disposing with this illusion, but in some sense deepening it, even as it further exacerbates the hierarchies that the illusion conceals. Understanding the uneven transition from capitalism to neo-feudalism and its various tendencies makes it possible to chart its strengths and its limits, points where new powers utilize old justifications, as well as a point where new hierarchies reveal older hierarchies that have become second nature. Thank you.
Hello? Before I start reading questions from our viewers, I wonder, because this is such an interesting conversation already, if I might just give you all an opportunity to respond to each other in a more, spontaneous manner than what you've just read and recited. If no one has anything to say. Yeah, okay, thanks, Jodi.
I really appreciate all of these responses, and I hope very much that people will let me see the written text, because it's super helpful. I'm also really happy to have the opportunity to present this at Red May, because this is early work, right? I'm trying to figure out what I want to do with this, and so to get these kinds of really thoughtful engagements is coming at the perfect time for me, and so I'm really grateful. I think, and some things I hope that we can clarify in the discussion. So first, I want to say first to Jason, I don't think I'm understanding your point regarding equality is even more important, but it's concealed as it's somehow, I didn't understand this. So you say like neo-feudalism is not erasing the fiction of equality, which is my claim is that it is. And I just want to use like a kind of stupid everyday example, maybe as a jump off point. And that's like back when we used to be able to fly on airplanes. You recall that there were these stupid little red carpets at the gates and a little post that said, here's for the people with, in group 1 or the premier this and the premier that. And you all stand over on this little stupid rug and you walk in first. And it was this kind of bizarre instantiation of an inequality among something that was basically equal, right? I mean, everybody's getting a relatively, because they would do this even on, let's say, regional flights that didn't have giant jets with first class. You still had this stupid instantiation of inequality at a cultural ideological level. And so I was thinking that your point had to do something, was an ideological point about the functioning of kind of the ideology of equality. And I just don't see that. And another example, a good friend of mine who I do political organizing work has been a server in a restaurant for years. And she ran for city council, and she was telling me that some of the people previously on council at the restaurant, when she was at the restaurant, they would look the other way as if they were embarrassed to see her as a server at work. It's like she could not be somebody who could run for office if she was a server. And so in those social interactions, the inequality was presented, assumed, acted on in a way that she felt and was rebelling against. So maybe I'm just not understanding your point about equality. And this leads to Ava's super provocative and powerful point regarding, okay, how, what does this mean for the institutions of mass struggle? Right. So I take your comments as saying, okay, I'll see your argument. Yeah, sure. Then what's the next phase? And what does that mean? And, I wish I had an example. I mean, I wish I had an answer. I don't. I love what you're saying about, there's something about political capacity stripped, right? About that's a condition of peasantry. But I also appreciate the way that you acknowledged at the same time the fact of peasant revolts and the fact of peasant insurrections. And I think it's not historically wrong to say that the two major revolutions of the 20th century, although they were in the name of the proletariat, were also, if not primarily, peasant revolutions. And that some versions of a Marxist dogma aside, the peasantry has been a revolutionary class. And that globally we see the peasantry still involved in, or continuously involved in organized political struggle, including with forms of organizations such as a revolutionary communist parties. And these are not the parties of the social democrats and their elections. These are revolutionary parties that are much more likely to be accompanied with an armed component, and whatever electoral component that they have is essentially as a way to raise awareness rather than it is a way to win elections. I think learning from those experiences and recognizing that the fact of this evisceration can mean the importance of organized militant revolutionary struggle, not necessarily tied to electoral struggle, because we know that right now is not a place. Like you said, the links there have been broken, right? The links towards something that we would call the accountability of the electoral system to the electorate, that does not exist right now. I think we can say for sure in the United States and England and other countries, we can debate them specifically. So that'd be my first two responses. And my other response to Philip, I think I'd also be interested to hear Ava's response to this, your emphasis on narrative. And like for me, I think of those themes in terms of the Zizekian decline of symbolic efficiency. And so it's not necessarily that the nation isn't available as that narrative, because I'm not convinced that in the country like the United States, the nation has ever been that persuasive a category to unify as many as people claim that it is, particularly because we have civil war, slave state, class struggle, the fragmentation already in the country. But I'd be interested to hear, more about how you think about that. I agree with that there's an absence of public narratives, but I would think about this in terms of the general decline of symbolic efficiency rather than something specific around the nation state.
Do we want to take these in the order that we?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I mean, I'll go there, Jodi, at the end, because I'm not convinced that my answer is convincing. I'm just throwing it out. But I wanted to start with Jason in the beginning. I mean, I don't think everything you say is true, but I don't think anybody is suggesting that we move from the capitalist mode of production to the feudal mode of production. I think what we're talking about is the arena of legitimation, how that has changed. Accumulation is in fact becoming even a purer form of capitalism. I think the notion is that capital now, has developed eyes in the back of its head and literally knows what laws it needs at every moment in its circuit as it goes on to accumulate and increase itself. So it has to be totally flexible to be able to become whatever it needs to be to keep going. And I'm interested to hear what Robert Brenner has to say in terms of, what avenues are available to capital now. But I think that the Neo-Feudalism is not a mode of production. It becomes something that's, I don't know what to call it. I wouldn't want to call it a particular ideology. It's what's happened when the two things that have happened. I mean, parcelization is real in terms of people going into these different sovereignties, and the political arena, which all of political theory discusses as if it still existed in some deliberative form, And I even sort of said to Jodi a couple of years ago as we were walking, you know, I always wondered why more democracy wasn't a radical program, you know, and at the end she says, you know, this is just too formalist, Philip, and she was absolutely right. You know, and I think Eva's question is about mass political desire no longer linking up to anything. That, of course, depends how much you can generate it and how much you can organize it and so forth. But I mean, that is the situation. The political structures don't work in any way at all. And yet there's this mass political desire that's frustrated. And, you know, I was thinking like, I wrote that in the chat, the medieval version to problems is if only the king knew. It's always the servants, the aristocrats, the bailiffs, the counts, and so forth. But if you got to the king, everything would be all right, which of course was ridiculous. The king was quite happy with what the tax collectors or whoever were doing. The version of it now is if only people would let the market work, we'd be all right. I mean, that's the thing we're dealing with as the kind of notion. The divinity is kind of put back there. And, you know, it's a bunch of crony yeah, there are people who are 1%, they rig the system, it's happening, but it's not the system that's the problem. If we could get these people out of there, their hands out of the till, and they would just let the market turn things around, we'd be all right. So that's the thing we sort of have to deal with. As far as the narrative point, I think the notion of neo-feudalism is, as you say, it's not any feudalism that has ever existed. It's not even just scholarly feudalism. It combines kind of mass cultural ideas like the images you show, which come together to form a feudalism that has never existed, and you borrow different elements of it to fall into this kind of alternate space. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that medieval narratives, even though they are decentered, are absolutely incoherent. They're just read with different perspectives from within different cultures that narrative is now. But when you're not with that, you're not within that culture, and what you turn out has the structure of a medieval narrative without the medieval cultural code, so that it's only incoherent, which is like what the right is turning out now at the moment every time. That's the sense I went in terms of medieval. Now, whether this is related to the decline in symbolic efficiency, totally. I followed Eva's clue about I found her argument in her book persuasive, that this whole Althusserian notion that you have to interpolate people and put them in you know, in a narrative, which is a narrative about the nation and a narrative about themselves, can only work if the state is giving you something and it's part of it. The effective stickiness comes from the nation. The state itself provides some things. I mean, it provides far more to capital, but something is happening. At a moment where the state provides nothing at all, then the nation has to go into overdrive to try to cover that gap. And the insane hyperbolism of kind of right-wing nationalism in the United States, you know, the idea that maybe in the 50s, you would have an American flag rally, but if someone put up a Nazi flag and a Confederate flag, people at the rally would take it away. At this moment, nobody even notices the difference between all of those things, or at least doesn't deny them anymore. It's like you said, it's a totally incoherent story coming out of everything from starting, you were talking about the Bush administration, starting with the WMDs. You said, look, it would have been very easy to find them, you know, to plant them and say, we found them, and cover it up and come up with a story. But they didn't stop providing stories because one didn't have to anymore. Everything didn't have to make sense. It didn't have to fit together. It just wasn't part of the demand. So that's the sense in which, you know, I call it, we could call it something else. I wasn't sort of suggesting the origin of it was necessarily neo-feudal, but I characterized it as that, I guess. So that's my sort of non-answer.
Can I jump in? I would just add to that, that for me, I think the crucial thing about the narrative question isn't even so much whether the narrative is national or something else, right? But it's more about a question of how power functions, right? How state power functions. Does it function through some, and I think interpolation is exactly right. Does it function through interpolation of a broad social component into some kind of stabilizing account of a shared world and a political reality? Or in the current moment, I mean, what seems to me so arresting is, which is essentially, we could just back up and say that is fundamentally the hegemonic project, right? It's a version of a narrative in which a broad social mass can be interpolated into what is essentially a bourgeois worldview. And so what I was trying to think about in neo-citizenship is the way in which that is no longer, it seems to me, the structure of power, right? Power operates precisely by dismissing that narrative. I think for me, I would link this to the difference between sort of disciplinary society and a society of control, right? So it's not a contest for hearts and minds. It's thoroughgoing surveillance, right? But it's a contest over data sets, browser histories, right? Polling numbers, and there is no stakes anymore in the production of any kind of hegemonic worldview. And I actually do think that's been a problem for the left, because we know how to be counter-hegemonic. We can do that. But being counter-hegemonic, right, has no traction any longer if there's no hegemony in which to intervene. But I would say too, just to go back to your other point, Jodi, I think that's really interesting about the note, right, of what would it mean to constitute a political party whose primary function is not particularly electoral. But my point of my comments were essentially to say how much work we have to do to get anywhere near there, certainly in the US right now, right? I think that's right. When I think about forms of mass political mobilization, I think about parties. You can think about the general strike, right? So there are certainly, and you were sort of talking about this, and I think that's right. There are forms of insurrection, or they're organizations that are political and insurrectionary, right? So the peasant uprising transforms into an actual political movement, right? Rather than a one-off food riot. I've just been really sort of breaking my head right now on the difficulty of even beginning to organize to get there, particularly in light of the way that there is such a fundamental, thoroughgoing conviction of incapacity. And I find that in every way. I've been organizing right now around university questions, right? What would it mean to use the COVID moment as an opportunity to really forward a vision of the post-scarcity university? And the challenge is not getting people to subscribe to the vision. The challenge is getting them to understand that there's any level on which we could actually wage that kind of a struggle, that it's not lost before we even begin.
Yeah, so to answer the question about equality, I guess partly what I was trying to think about in thinking about the fiction of equal actors meeting the market is the way that Marx talks about the wage as the sort of genesis of a kind of mystification. And it seems that, and maybe it's more of a mystification of exploitation than a generation of a certain kind of equality. Because when the worker gets a wage from the capitalist, there's an understanding that the capitalist has money and the worker doesn't have money. There's an understanding that's predicated on a kind of inequality. But it seems to me that it's predicated on a kind of equality that still has on its horizon the idea that, you know, one day I could be a capitalist too. I could be on the other side of that equation, and I could be paying someone a wage. And a part of what sort of papers over the inequality is this understanding that when I get my wage, I'm being paid the fair value of my labor. I'm being paid what the exploitation is in some sense concealed. I'm getting the value that I'm creating. And it seems to me that And thinking about some of these tendencies towards neo-feudalism, it seems to be two things are happening that still seem to be happening under the auspices of that fiction. One is there's an increased obscuring of what exactly it is I'm surrendering to these various corporations, in terms of the data I'm surrendering, in terms of even in terms of things like debt. This is something that Hart and Negri talk about in the indebted section of their piece from some 10 years back, where they talked about the idea that, you know, the difference between being a worker and being indebted is the indebted don't even know to what extent everyone else is also indebted as well. It's kind of destroyed any kind of collective belonging. And so on the one hand, there's an increased sort of mystification of exactly what it is, what value I'm creating, what sort of wealth I'm creating on the one hand. But tied with that, it seems to me, there's an increased recognition of a new kind of power of property over all types of existence, right? There's a certain idea. I mean, I've had this happen when I like try to talk to like students about like all the data they're giving over to various social media companies. There's, on the one hand, there's a sense of like, oh, but they're giving me so much that's worthwhile. Why wouldn't I want to do that? But on the other hand, there's this much more disturbing notion of like, well, they created this thing, good for them. Shouldn't they have this control over, you know, over my information, over society, and so on and so forth. So the social right of property has become, that's what I was sort of talking about at the end there, that the social right of property, which when Marx wrote about this, he meant this kind of as a scandal, right? The idea that property shouldn't be able to control people's lives, you know, like in the manifesto and so on. That has become sort of more openly claimed. But I still think there is this kernel of the same kind of mystification, because the fundamental mystification of capital, as I understand it, is simply the idea that I, as a worker, could one day occupy the other side of the pole, and thus everything that's unjust about the relation between the worker and capitalist is in some sense justified by my aspirations to cross that line. That's what I was trying to get at.
So I think that's super interesting, Jason. I think it might just also be a point where we don't agree, because it seems to me that at this point, you know, and it's become clearer since, let's say, at least the 2008 crisis, is that substantial majorities in the United States do not think that they could ever be on the other side, that's part of this, what the mainstream media reports is like, and, you know, majority of respondents to polls don't think that their kids will have a better life than they have. And so that it's this kind of sort of mystification that is in fact been shattered. And that what people are recognizing, and I hear it with young people who are like, my retirement plan is socialism, because they recognize full well there's no way that they're going to have that they will be able to, via the wage, if they're lucky enough to get it, to even to survive. Like they will remain, like, I mean, this is actually, I think, even a mainstream idea, that the pervasiveness of renters, the inability to own a home, even as you've got massive land grabs, right? Whether or not it's billionaires in the West who are buying up, scores of thousands of land, that whether or not it's the holding of multiple kinds of apartments in global cities done by global citizens. And even as majorities don't have a capacity to live in the cities where they work because the rents are too damn high, much less own a home, as was part of the fantasy of what a successful life looked like mid-century. So I think even on the terms that you've described regarding the underlying sense of I can be on that other side, I don't think that holds. But I don't know if that's an empirical question or a matter of interpretation or what, but that's maybe where we disagree.
We had a very interesting discussion called We Have Never Been Middle Class, which is based on that book from Virchow by Hadass Weiss, which I really recommend. It's short and I think it's lovely. And in a sense, she agrees to some degree with Jason in the sense that she says that the middle class is the fantasy of capitalism. The middle class doesn't exist in a real sense. It's a fantasy generated by capitalism. You know, it's essentially like from the standpoint of Marx, there's the people who own the means of production, the people who don't. There's capital and labor. And then this other thing, the middle class, logically, there's no place for it. Historically, you can look at the 19th century and sort of see a group of workers acquire a certain amount of property, which then becomes what keeps them from maybe falling back into being workers again, or having to work at the end of their lives, or giving them retirement. But it also becomes this fantasy generated, like, as Jason says, like there's a fantasy generated by the wage. The middle class is a fantasy that comes out of capital for many of those things. But that fantasy seems to have taken huge hits at the moment, as Jodi says, but there is something to say that it's an endemic fantasy too. It's part of the nature of capital to generate that.
And so if the fantasy is taking hits and it's endemic and part of the nature of capitalism, maybe the fact that it's taken hits and no longer persuasive is indicative of these neo-feudalizing tendencies and the way that capitalism is turning itself into something worse.
I think the other thing is, everybody has felt, generally that there is a certain time where even the people who are running capitalism believe that they could more or less provide for the whole society. They could make it all work. Everybody wouldn't get everything, and there'd certainly be poverty, but there's a certain point where the people who are running it realize that it's not going to work for anything. And that's changed their whole attitude to what they're doing and how they're doing it. In the Trump cabinet's way, bringing in predators and vultures in the energy industries who feel like only got 20 good years before any kind of profits will be prohibited by a broad majority. So they're interested in kind of running it out. But I think the notion that capitalism works for the whole society, that it creates the wealth of nations rather than individual billionaires, is something that the capitalist class has more or less given up on. Otherwise, they wouldn't be buying places in New Zealand to get to when things get hot here. So I think that's an important political factor at the moment.
Maybe we could also add to that point, Philip, that was it really that capitalists were like, oh, we're doing this because we want to benefit everyone? Or was that a position forced upon them through workers' struggles, right? As workers forced them to have to capitulate. And so it was when workers were strong in unions, and it was clear that their position in production was a site of strength for them, and that they could, when they were united, they could force concessions on capitalism. And one of the challenges that we have, since the changes in the economy since the late 70s, is that we don't see the way that workers' strength is exercised in production, particularly in the United States, in the same way that it was, say, in the 50s and 60s, right? The changes in offshoring of factories, down the move away from large scale industrial production and move into surfaces. And I think that points to some of the challenges that Eva's mentioned in organizing at the site of the university, particularly in response to COVID. I hear you. I think that's it's a huge challenge, and I think a lot of that depends on the kind of school where one teaches and the sort of larger sets of of alliances and that's possible to make, like whether via contingent faculty workers, organized graduate students, as well as sort of a secretarial and administrative staff and housekeeping staff. I mean, the UK, I think, did better on that score, uniting across teaching staff and housekeeping staff in the last couple of years. I mean, that's where I want to start looking as I think about what are the ways to organize under these conditions at that work site, because that's not easy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I would just say, I mean, I agree with that. It's about, it can't just be about contingent faculty. It has to be about tenure line faculty, contingent faculty, staff, custodial staff, students, right? Graduate students who are instructors, undergraduates. So it has to be across all the different kind of constituencies of the university. But the other question, I think that the other challenge posed in this moment where no one is pretending any longer, right? That that public sentiment matters, right? Is what kind of campaign do you organize, right? So we think in terms of organizing a pressure campaign. And part of the problem I think one runs into is that even a successful pressure campaign is unlikely to be effective. It will be managed, right, by the ever escalating, ever better paid ranks of managers whose job it is to manage these kinds of situations, right? So in other words, we assume, because the notion of a pressure campaign assumes that there has to be a kind of broad consent, right, to the existing organization of the university on the part of its different constituencies. And I don't think that's, I think we're in a moment now where it would actually take something on the order of a general strike, right? Students not going to class, faculty refusing to teach, staff, we would have to, it would require sort of shutting down the university. In a way, does that make sense? That I think that it's also that some of our repertoire, right, of publicity, calling attention to things, pressuring, demanding equity, right? That kind of, that repertoire no longer works very well.
It's one of the things that I think is interesting about the university as a site is the consistent attack on the university from the right now for over 30 or 40 years. And so defunding it, but also against it for sites of liberal faculty, against as a place where people aren't learning what they need to learn to succeed in the market. And now with the kind of arc of the graph of inequality that we have, there's not a need for people to have the sorts of degrees that we educate them for. So I think there's an underlying economic change and we feel now the weakness, like you said, once the the kind of the blinders have come off, or the rhetoric has now, the nice rhetoric is gone. I mean, there's not a sense that citizenship matters. There's not a sense that the university is educating citizens. And there's not a sense that the kinds of jobs that most people will have require a college education. So it seems that what's shifting is the real realization that, my God, this is not an economy that supports a broadly educated middle class anymore. And that's where the fight is, right? I mean, so no wonder it's hard for us to organize at the level of universities, and no wonder. I mean, we know that there will be the universities that educate the elites will survive, and they will continue to educate the elites. And then what happens to everybody else?
Well, Jeremy Gilbert said something interesting about that yesterday. He said, they will, because the university has become so important for the knowledge economy after Bayh-Dole, and because it's linked into that startup thing, they will never let it go back to be what it was for 10 years between 1962 and 73 or whatever. The university, they're never, we're never going to go back to no administrators, all teachers and faculty, this time between where students come and experiment, try out learning things, just learn, don't know where they're going, and so forth. The reason that happened in the 60s at the time is the university wasn't important economically, terribly economically, the way it is now to capitalism. But because of that, so I thought that was an interesting opinion. I never heard that before.
I think we've got to think about, or I'd be interested in knowing how that was specified, right? Like which parts of the university and important to capitalism in what ways, and in what ways is capital explicitly outsource the education of its workforce rather than letting it be something it's responsible for, right? When support for public education is cut, what that means is that individuals are responsible for their own education. And so once again, everything that capital needs, it doesn't pay for, but it requires that other people to generate. So I would be interested to see in what way university education is essential for capital, and for how many, and how broadly, and what fields. I think it's, I think that's a harder question.
I have a question, or one of the things I think is very striking, Jodi, that you brought up, and it's something that I've thought about and wondered about a lot in terms of this neo-feudal tendency, is the fundamental change of, say, being a worker versus being someone who drives a car for Uber or has an apartment for Airbnb, where you do have, because the tendency that Marx and like Lenin picked up on was this tendency of capital that owning the means of production was going to be so, like, it was only going to be open to the most huge monopoly capitalists, right? And there is a sense in which, cars used to be just consumer goods, right? There used to be things you needed them to get to and from work, but the idea that you could use them to produce some kind of revenue for yourself was kind of unheard of. And we have the car, we have the apartment, the home. We also have, in some sense, I feel like the computer does the same thing with this fantasy that anyone can use a computer to start up anything. And I'm thinking these in a similar kind of lines, that these are kind of fictions of equality as well, right? That you have enough, everyone has enough property that they could utilize that property to become something, but they're actually sites of an incredibly an exploitation that goes beyond the wage, right? Because in some sense, if you're an Uber driver, you have to keep that car clean, you have to do all this sort of stuff, but you're only paid for the moment between picking up passenger one and picking up and dropping them off. There's a certain sense in which the car actually becomes not a property that allows you to advance, but it actually becomes the site of an exploitation that dips below even wage exploitation, right? Most Uber drivers make below minimum wage, for example. But I'm thinking about that property ownership under neoliberalism and its role as both a site of exploitation, but a site of a kind of mystification as well, to go along with what I was saying earlier.
Well,
Yeah.
Isn't that pure Gary Becker?
The difference, well, let me answer Jason, and then say why I don't think it's the same as Gary Becker. So Jason, I don't think of this as a kind of, as there being an underlying mystification of equality. Everybody knows that that when you're having to rent out your apartment or your car, it's because you need the money. Right? It's like a kind of second order proletarianization, right? So you've lost other opportunities to sell your labor power. So what do you have left to sell? Maybe your own dwelling or your own transportation, your own means of work. You're now selling back to the capitalists, or to actually now a form of a rentier who is really just renting your stuff. Weirdly, like turning your stuff into means of exploiting you. That's just so wild, right? And now with the freaking COVID, right, all of where we dwell has now become yet a new site of exploitation for us when we've had to work from home. Now, that's, I'm not saying that is a worse form of exploitation than the people who are still going to work. I'm just saying it's another version of this turning of what one had and had thought of as just something one purchased now into another instrument for the capital accumulation of another. And I think the difference between this and Gary Becker, Philip, is that Gary Becker was thought about it was human individual person capital, not the person's things as something that was going to now doubly be instruments of their oppression. It's like now if we were Luddites, we would, instead of breaking the looms, we break our own stuff. Like we have to break our own phones and computers and to tear our own apartment's house because this is where our exploitation occurs. I mean, it's like really just, self-destructive.
Shall we hear some questions then?
Sure.
Okay. Here is our first question, directed to Jodi, but to everyone, of course, also. Jodi, you identify the move toward forms of rentier finance capital as key to the shift of neo-feudalism. But isn't this the problem with, quote, fictitious capital? Its expansion is predicated on decline of productive growth and investment bubbles. For example, Nick Sniernicek argues that the expansion of rentier services by tech companies is based on the lack of real profitability and search for growth in the industry. Without real growth, how do you see this framework surviving?
So I don't know if I understand the question, right? It seems like the question is just stating what a version of my argument back. Right, which is namely that there's a growth in rentier services because of a lack of real profitability, right? I didn't talk about the lack of profitability. What I described was the growth, was the tendency around forms of rent as becoming primary vehicles for accumulation as opposed to commodity production, right? Instead, I was emphasizing rents in a broad sense, as well as basic extraction and force. So maybe I just don't understand the question.
So Nick's argument is that of all the tech companies, Amazon is the one that has the most profitable future because of its essentially owning this Amazon cloud services, which everybody buys. Everybody has to move into. That all the other services, well, that is rent, that's true, but that all the other ones don't have a model to continue doing what they're doing because the ad.
That's not true. It's not about ads. Actually, something like Google, like one of the things one of the ways that Google is making an incredible amount of money and dominating, dominating the development of information technology or I can't remember the term. It's not immaterial labor. It's like how they dominate AI, artificial intelligence, is they've got servers that are so enormous that their machine learning algorithms can learn faster than anybody else out there. And so what this means is for anyone who is developing high-powered algorithms, if they're going to test their algorithms to see if they're capable of learning, they have to rent time on Google servers. So Google can control then the academic production, the production of former entrepreneurs, because no one has enough server capacity to train their artificial intelligence algorithms outside of Google or maybe Amazon. But Google exerts this kind of feudal coercive force, just like the freaking water mill that Marx describes and that Perry Anderson picks up. It's not about the doggone ads, right? It's about the data and then the storage and then the reflexivization of these. But what's really, really wild is the way that Google's monopoly and dominance of server capacity is changing the kinds of artificial intelligence algorithms that are created. It changes the forms of natural language processing, because what it can say is like, oh, your program isn't fast enough. And ours is faster, and so you haven't reached state-of-the-art results. But why? Because theirs are able to run programs longer and in a more elaborate way than anybody else. I don't know if I've explained that very, very well, but it's not about ads. It's about the control of of natural language processing, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. Can't hear you, Philip.
I might have misstated it. He might have included Google with Amazon. I think Facebook and some of the others he put as having a future that was didn't show a clear path to profitability. So.
Okay, our next question, which maybe has kind of been touched on already, but this is a more direct asking of the question. How do you envision intra-class conflict and power struggles playing out from within the neo-feudalist lordly class?
Yeah, I mean, the answer I want to say is with guillotines, but I'm afraid that that may seem to flip. Honestly, I don't see how it cannot be violent. And so the kind of conflict that I see as most likely is ones where there is ongoing oppression and deprivation, and then reaction. And the reaction takes a form that elicits more and more police repression. And then there's counter reaction to the police repression. And then the challenge is how to make a response that's organized and has a capacity to win and escape this cycle. And I think it's going to be a long slog. I mean, in addition to that kind of sort of fundamental sets of violent standoffs, I mean, we can still try to do forms of ideological warfare. We can still try elections and changing the law. But I mean, that's also long and hard, and I don't see any hope for that on its own. I think that under these conditions, I mean, Ava rightly brought up, right, the evisceration of the space of that's been understood as the space of politics within bourgeois parliamentary democracy for 40 or 50 years. That's been eviscerated. So I don't see that as sort of coming back to life unless unless people are forced to, right? Unless their capitalist class, the finance class, the billionaire class is absolutely forced to, and that's not easy. I don't know I'd be interested in what others think about that question too.
Yeah, does anyone else have any thoughts?
Well, I think it's important to keep a distinction between force and violence. Force is kind of left out of the equation, but it can be very effective and go beyond parliamentary politics. One is stopping the people, the delegates entering the WTO in 1999, where they just couldn't get in. They were obstructed and there was force. And the other thing is, think about what the Republicans did during the recount, how they used force to kind of win the Florida recount. They sent all these aides down to where it was being counted in Broward County, and they literally went in the room and wouldn't let the people count. I'm just saying that there are probably a whole variety of actions on the way to absolute exchanging violence with the police that are also things that have to become part of the diversity of tactics.
I would just add to that and you've actually said this, Jodi, right? That people, it's always in the process of a struggle that people come into a sense of their agency, right? So it's not that they have some pre-constituted sense of their political capacity, which they then exercise, but it's sort of always on the terrain of struggle that is elaborated. I think the challenge right now is to figure out where and on what scale it's possible to intervene in the absence of these structures of mass political organizations, right? In the absence of a party that speaks to left interests, in the absence of strong unions, right? I think, I'm just really just thinking in terms of sort of the coming weeks and months, right? And so I think, you and I have a lot of sympathy with some of the concerns you raised, Jodi, about, because I think what you were getting at was sort of that, right? The sort of scale of the left imaginary right now. which is highly localized, which is very social media oriented, right? Very much very sort of very much orchestrated around questions of performance, right? Publicity, and I think there's a reason for that sort of small scale, right? It's sort of the absence of a kind of larger scale, existing scale of political organization. And so I don't know, I guess my answer to that question is that it will be interesting to see what are the local sites where something more powerful starts to emerge that could be scaled up into some larger forms of political mobilization at the regional or national or even larger scales.
What do people think of the LA teachers strike?
Last year?
Yeah.
It was awesome.
Yeah, I thought so too.
But what I think did not get talked about enough about that is that, as from everything I've read, that was a strike that was years and years and years in the making, right? So that's exactly what I mean, that it's the sort of long-term micro-organizing around small wins that start to make people feel that they can reclaim a level of political capacity, right? It's not, I mean, I think it was sort of framed as this kind of, it was a sort of rare moment of hope, right? But what was not sufficiently part of the narrative was how many years of careful building of the capacity to strike went into that one successful action.
Jason, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah. I mean, I think to go back to the kind of the conversation that we've been having, I think that, because I've been sort of pushing this point that the mystifications of capital continue to exist, and Jodi's been sort of pushing back on that. I feel like they're going to evaporate more and more. I mean, I feel like the tendency to, I mean, with the evacuation of a whole series of jobs and a whole series of sort of fabricated kind of entrepreneurial wealth that was able to exist, I feel like the future is going to be much starker in terms of the divide between. But though I still wonder, we didn't really talk about this enough, because I know Jodi brought this up, about the other kind of neo-feudalist aspect of the present, and that is the kind of the Jordan Peterson type moment of, and I would add to that, like even more explicit forms of sort of racial ideologies and so on, very anti-enlightenment and that sort of aspect. And so I feel like, because, if we're really going to talk about neo-feudalism, we have to talk about, what are going to be our new priests of our dark ages, so to speak. And so I do, in some sense, agree that some of the mystifications around capital itself are going to be increasingly falling apart, but there's no guarantee. I mean, obviously, because it depends on things like struggle and politics, that's going to necessarily tend towards something better. But I do think we're all going to look at a much starker sense of the divide, but that doesn't necessarily mean that can be rewritten in all kinds of racist imaginaries and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, everything depends on the fight back, right? Everything depends on what we're able to organize and what we're able to accomplish through struggle. This is one of the things that I've found, I don't know about the rest of y'all, but like frustrating by some kind of media opinion pieces about what will the post-COVID world look like, as if it just is given to us and happens to it and is not a product of struggle and choices and actual fight, as something we can actually do something about. But too much, it's like, oh, it'll be this way, it'll be that way.
So we're back to the beginning of the 18th Brumaire here. We make it, but not in circumstances that we've chosen. And what these circumstances are at the moment is hard to tell. I mean, I do think the neo-feudalist critique adds something to what we know of capitalism. We're obviously not talking on the level of a mode of production, as we talked later, but you know, just as Ava's work, you know, tracked the total abandonment of elites in terms of creating norms or trying to bring everybody into a happy story of the nation and just sort of leaving them on their own in their own unrealities, and giving nothing at all except the notion, the old entrepreneur of the self notion that if you don't make it, it's your own fault, which a lot of people still buy into, you know. The question is, how does capitalism continue through repression and surveillance without the kind of legitimation that it had in the past, when it's not even trying to do it because it senses that it won't work, and we just don't know, you know, how that. That's why I put that other medieval thing, if only the king knew, and if only they let the market work. I mean, the number of people who think that the market, even with all the bad things they know about crony capitalism and so forth, that there's something behind there called the market, which is just a generator of equality and abundance and a cornucopia for all. And it's just a question of letting that go and getting the bad people out of it, that we have the good capitalism instead of the bad capitalism. I don't even know where you begin on that, you know? But how do we end on a note that we can take away? That's it's a fascinating discussion, first of all.
I would just add to that, Philip, that I think part of the incoherence is exactly that people can hold, many people do, I mean, I would say many people hold actually massively contradictory beliefs, right? One is that some version of if I'm in crisis, if I can't make ends meet, it's my own fault, and the market is actually the, you know, all-knowing and needs to be allowed to kind of function unhampered. And at the same time, the recognition that they are being screwed, right? So I think that's part of the incoherence, that it's not a, and that's where, I think that's where what my rejoinder to Jason would be a little bit, that I found when I talk to students that I will get, for instance, about things like the ways in which data companies use their data, that I will get a whole mix of bizarrely incoherent things, like good for them, right? I must, you know, some sort of version of the fantasy of, you know, I want to become, I want to develop my own platform, right? I want to be Mark Zuckerberg, and a complete recognition of how their data is being expropriated, right? So it's not a zero, I guess what I'm saying is it's not a zero-sum game. And I do think that both creates openings for what Jodi was calling the ideological struggle, but also real challenges for it. Because again, what we're taking up is not a kind of coherent view, but this really dissociated understanding of the world.
I want to add, like, I think that political struggle is possible here and now. I think that some of it requires recognizing first division, and you're not trying to reach everybody. You're not trying to change everybody's mind. You're trying to build, I would say, build fighting cadre. And you know, there are national organizations, even in the U.S., that are small revolutionary parties that do both organizing work at local levels, work within movement groups, and work within unions, and work to coordinate national actions. And it'll be interesting to see if more people you know, involved in kind of discussions like Red May start to tune into what's the work of small political parties, because it's something that's not just local level municipalism, and it's not just one-off actions, but it's something that tries to build the connection between actions that happen at multiple levels. So for example, this weekend there will be cancel the rents and mortgages car caravan actions all over the country, and that's coordinated by a national party. So it's interesting that there are options there. It's not like there's nothing present, but it does require, you know, a kind of commitment when it's hard to see what the future is going to look like.
I think that's a good point to end on, even though I'd be quite happy talking for another hour or two with this collection of people, all of whose books I have enjoyed immensely and whose presence and company I enjoy, and I'm sure you have. But we better move on. After all, we're going to have, I don't know, 7 or 8 more events. So we need to kind of recover for those and get back. So thank you, Jodi, for a wonderful presentation, which wins the Academy Award for cinematography, or at least slide cinematography. And thank you, Jason and Eva and Gus for moderating. And thank you for watching. If you, I do want to mention that I made a terrible mistake in the beginning. As we're trying to figure out what happens to the economy and who but Robert Brenner should we go to ask, we've moved the event from Tuesday to Friday. I believe it's Friday afternoon. So look on the YouTube, to find out the new scheduled time. What we are having tomorrow, however, is tomorrow we're having Thinking the Pandemic, State and Revolution at 5 p.m. And on Wednesday, the Post-Pandemic Condition at 1, and the Neoliberal City and the Plague at 6. On Thursday, the Weapon of Organization on Mario Tronti and 21st Century Struggles with Andrew Anastasi and Magali Miranda Alcazar and a number of other comrades. And at 5 p.m., The Age of Circulation Struggles. So lots of good stuff. Look at it, click, donate, give us money, www.redmayseattle.org, and or go to the YouTube description. You can donate there and subscribe to our YouTube so we can get those live real-time CC captions. Thanks very much. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thanks.